So, Eric, now that I'm 50 years old, I've been working out like crazy every day, but I'm not seeing any results in the mirror. So I've decided that my only hope of having a hot, smoking body is being cremated after I die.
Ah, jeez. Come on.
It's the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome to the 82nd episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. If you've been listening to us since the early days and thought that we'd never make it to 82 episodes, we agree. For those of you who are new to the show, Paperback Warrior is the internet's finest resource for vintage paperback discussion and reviews in the adventure, crime, horror, western, spy, science fiction, sleaze, and war fiction genres. You know those old paperbacks from 70 years ago with the lurid cover illustrations? We tell you about what's inside those books and the authors who created them. My name's Eric, and I'm going to bring on my co-host Tom to talk about today's episode.
Thank you, Eric. A couple months ago, we discussed how categories like science fiction and mystery have so many subcategories within them that they're not always useful as genre descriptions. Like if I'm sitting next to someone on an airplane and they tell me they're a mystery writer, I don't know if they write hard-boiled stuff like Mickey Spillane or if they write about women's quilting groups who solve mysteries with the help of their very intuitive pet cats.
Yeah, that's true. And we had talked a few months ago about how science fiction could really, just encompass both post-apocalyptic adventures like, Deathlands or Outlanders or something like that, as well as the earthbound alien invasion stories, or even something like a space opera like Dune.
Exactly. So these genre categories are very broad. Now that's my point here. The same thing is true in horror fiction. A demonic possession story like William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist is something very different from a haunted house novel like Richard Matheson's Hell House, or the story of a tormented girl with telekinesis like Stephen King's Carrie. Well, Eric, there's a subcategory of horror that has grown in popularity lately called extreme horror. Used to be known as splatterpunk, and the idea is that they ratchet up the intensity and graphic violence in the books. One of the most popular authors of extreme horror today is a guy named Matt Shaw. And during his career, Jack Ketchum certainly veered into that lane. Well, today I want to tell you about an author who some call the inventor of extreme horror, or the godfather of splatterpunk. His stories appeared in the pulp magazines in the 1930s and 1940s, and they've been collected into two anthologies available today. He wrote those stories under the name of Russell Gray, and during the feature, I'm going to unmask him and tell you why he's important today. But we're going to talk about that later in the feature. My review later in the show is going to be a book called The Hoodlums by John Eagle from 1953 that was just reprinted by Black Gat Books under the author's real name, George Benet. What's your review today, Eric?
Well, today I'm going to be reviewing a 1982 action-adventure novel called Blood Oath by a guy named David Morrell. He's somebody we don't really talk about much here on the show, so I think I'm going to break the ice.
Good. I mean, he is adventure fiction royalty, so we definitely need to cover him. Before we get into the reviews, I want to tell you about a series that I found and a weird experience with that series that derailed my reading experience. Now, Eric, let me ask you, when it comes to series titles, how important is it for you to read them in order, starting with number one?
Oh, man. Gosh, yeah, I would say it's really important. And you know why? Because I'm a completist, and I have to start with number one. If I don't start there and I just start reading like a mid-series book or an entry or something like that, the whole book is just going to be off-kilter for me, and I'm going to regret the decision thinking the book would have had more impact if I invested more time in that series character or characters.
Got it. It used to be important to me. It was almost pathological. Now, some series titles, it clearly doesn't matter. Nick Carter Killmaster, for example, or the Executioner books after Don Pendleton left the series. As long as you understand the basic premise of the series, you're going to be just fine. So I've been getting better at just grabbing the one I have, and if it looks good, I just read it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And sometimes in a jam, if I don't have the prior book to read, I'll use sites like Mystery File or Paul Bishop or James Reasoner's blog or Spy Gals and Gals, something like that, to catch up on the series backstory. And it's not like the old days where if you missed the entire 1970s run of Batman stories, you'd be completely lost if you were picking up issue 300 in the year 1980 or something. There's resources now that can expedite things quickly to let you catch up.
Right, exactly. So I have no idea where it came from, but I was browsing my own library and I came upon this book. Let me hand this to you, and I want to get your initial impressions of what I've just handed you.
Good Night, Garrity, by the author's name is Alan Nixon, and it's an Avon published book. It looks like maybe 1970s.
Got it. So the book is Good Night, Garrity, as you read. It was published in December 1969. Which was the month my wife was born and 5 months before I was born. Yes, Eric, I married an older woman.
Nice.
And that technically makes her a cougar.
Ah.
The author of the book's this guy, Alan Nixon, and he was a real guy. He lived between the years 1915 and 1995. During his life, he worked as a football player, a pro wrestler, a model, a movie actor, and most importantly, a paperback novelist. Now, the book you're holding there in your hand is the second book in the Garrity series. The series only lasted for 3 novels and 1 short story. The first book was Get Garrity from 1966 that was also printed as just Garrity. And then the one that I owned, Good Night Garrity, that you have there from 1969. And then the last book was Go for Garrity from 1970. And then it seems that Avon just canceled the series. Now, he brought Garrity back for a single short story in October 1976 called Garrity's Gamble. It was published in Mystery Monthly magazine. Now, Garrity, this character, is Tony Garrity, and he's the most dangerous private eye in all of Los Angeles, and that's apparently saying a lot. He's this 43-year-old bitter old bastard. Anyway, getting back to my point, I owned the second book of the series, but not the first. Now, I figured I'm a quick study, and I've read my share of hard-boiled crime novels from this era. I felt that I could probably just jump into this Garrity universe in the second installment without being lost. Man, oh man, was I wrong. It was clear from the opening pages of Good Night, Garrity, now this is book 2, that a lot of stuff happened in the first book that Garrity is still processing and dealing with. I mean, we're talking personal tragedies, professional upheavals, stuff like that. I'm just a few pages into this first chapter, and it felt like I was tuning into like Breaking Bad halfway through season 3. So before I tell you what I did, Eric, tell me what you would do under those circumstances. You've heard good things. You want to read the book. You don't own book 1. You've started book 2. It's clear that it's going to spoil a lot of stuff from book 1. What do you do?
All right, so I'm not going to read another page, and I'm going to go on Messenger or email, and I'm going to ask you if you have the first book. And normally you do. And then I get it when I come over to record this very show.
All right, so basically you give up on book 2 and you just set it aside and go right back to book 1. You don't try to power through book 2.
No, definitely not.
I did the same thing.
Okay.
So I set the book down and I stopped reading, and then I went on to Abe Books and I bought a copy of book 1, Get Garrity, for $8 and ordered it. Now, I have some idea how Get Garrity ends because I kind of spoiled it for myself by reading the first few pages of Good Night, Garrity. But I'm also kind of curious how Garrity goes from being the most dangerous private eye in L.A. to what I glimpsed he was in the beginning of book 2. The problem is that I've now moved on to other things, right? I was in the mood for Garrity, and then I kind of had to shuck that feeling when it became clear that book 2 was not going to be an appropriate entry point. So then I ordered book 1, a week goes by, and now I've kind of moved on to other things.
You've lost that loving feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm still going to read Garrity number 1 and probably something in the next few months or so. And if it's good, I'm going to read number 2 and probably get number 3. I'll keep you updated when that happens. I can't imagine a world where I'm so hung up on Garrity that I order the Mystery Digest from 1976 to get that short story, but you never know. Maybe this thing's brilliant. Okay, but again, for the listeners' purposes, the series called Garrity by Alan Nixon. Robert Randizzi told me it's actually a very good series. He liked it a lot, and I trust that guy a lot, so we'll see. So, Eric, we got a lot to cover this feature, and I got a book review to do later, so why don't we just jump right into it if that's okay with you? Before we do the feature, I should probably warn listeners that this feature is going to involve some pretty gruesome descriptions of violence and torture aimed at women. If that's offensive to you, I get it. It should be offensive to you. No judgments. But given that, this may or may not be the episode for you. I promise I'm not trying to make things gratuitous, but I also don't want to dance around the content that we're discussing or treat you, the listener, like an infant. So if you're listening to this while driving your kids to school, man, this is on you, Dad, not me. So maybe as a jumping off point, Eric, what is your experience, if any, with the literary genre of extreme horror?
I honestly don't care for it, and I never liked Edward Lee's output, and I'll probably get crucified for this for saying it, but I didn't like Clive Barker's stuff. In fact, the only book I've ever destroyed in my life was an extreme horror novel. It was called The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. It disgusted me. Mm-hmm. I ripped it up and I threw it in the trash.
Did you finish it?
I did. I read the whole.
I made it about halfway through, and I thought, oh boy, I see where this is going.
Who reads that?
I don't know, man. It was not for. I could not finish it just because the whole thing got super disturbing, really awkward, really uncomfortable. Once I saw what the direction it was headed, I mean, I don't destroy books, so I probably got credit for it because I'm not an idiot, Eric.
Right. I threw it away, but it reminded me of the stigma of that book reminded me of that horror movie, the Serbian film. I was talking about where
you got me.
Okay, never mind.
Anyway, so extreme horror is not my preferred genre either. I like my horror to be a slow burn that's like starts out kind of benign and then gets scarier and scarier as the story unfolds. I thought The Ruins by Scott Smith did that really well. Did you ever read that one?
I did, yes.
Okay, I love that one. I also thought that recent book, I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid, did an amazing job of filling me with this ever-increasing sense of creeping dread, although avoid the movie on that one. That one sucked.
Is that movie out already?
Yeah, it's terrible. It's on Netflix. Don't watch it. No matter how tempted you are, please don't watch it.
I love that
book. For the
book.
love of all things holy, don't watch it.
All right, I love that book. I read a contemporary one just last week. Since we're ahead some of it on our production schedule, it's called The Mosquito Man by Jeremy Bates. It was published in 2019, and it was a brisk read. But the author would stop and do these little backstories on the characters to fully develop them. The idea was to slowly draw the reader in and force them to relate to the characters and, I guess, ultimately care whether they survive the horror. But it was great. And, Tom, I think one of the best slow burn novels that exist in horror is The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson. Did you read that?
No, I mean, I've had it over the years. And I just sort of, because I'm so familiar with the Amityville horror story, because the movies and all that, I never really bothered with the book. The book's good, though. Huh?
Oh, it's fantastic. And it's this countdown over the course of a month to just complete insanity on the part of the family. But those sort of books scare me on so many different levels, but simply just doing a plot that starts out with, 1, 2, 3, go kill everything. It just bores me.
Right. So I'm a member of this Facebook group called Books of Horror, and it's really great. It's a really positive and supportive online community of horror book fans, and they share reviews and thoughts on horror fiction. And there's a lot of people who are really into the extreme horror thing there. And there's a guy named Matt Shaw who seems to be a very real favorite in the genre. And sometimes I actually hear extreme horror being referred to as splatterpunk. Is that a term that's familiar to you? Have you ever heard that term?
I have. I've heard of that in horror fiction and even in comics, but I can't say I've ever read any of it.
Yeah, and Wikipedia has a pretty informative entry on splatterpunk. The gist is that it was a movement in horror fiction that originated in the 1980s and featured graphic violence and with gore that has no limits. The term was actually coined by David J. Shaw at the World Fantasy Convention in Providence, Rhode Island. The rise of this genre was met with extreme controversy, especially with the old guard of horror fiction, like Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho. He was a vocal critic. When he was talking about splatterpunk, he said, "There's a distinction to be made between that which inspires terror and that which inspires nausea."
Yeah.
William F. Nolan and Charles L. Grant were also really critical of this splatterpunk literary movement. So it's a term that's really been replaced over the years by the term extreme horror, which emerged when Amazon Kindle, when the e-reader was launched, and self-published authors stopped being stigmatized as vanity press guys and started being seen as entrepreneurs bringing their fiction to fans without the middlemen of big publishing houses. Now, in the world of Kindle direct publishing, whose rise really paralleled the collapse of mass-market mid-list paperbacks, these extreme horror authors really found a voice and an audience.
I'd say as we sit here in 2021, it's just all a conglomerate of horror, right? Like authors are mixing up these styles, and some of them are doing like retro 80s safer horror, or they're going all out with some kind of gore fest. But then you've got authors that stick with traditional horror, but then they'll team up with some author and do something totally wacky. That's splatterpunk or extreme horror or whatever. It's just no holds barred now. And I think with extreme horror, it's become just sort of a catchphrase used for marketing. And I think as a whole, we're so desensitized that the extreme part of it doesn't even make an impact now. like it did back in the early to mid 20th century, which is what you're talking about.
Well, I think people fail to be shocked by stuff anymore. That's for sure. And but I will never turn anybody. I'll never look down my nose at anybody who likes a different kind of horror than what I like. I mean, you like what you like. I'm not going to get upset if you dig a different dessert topping than what I like.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I've set the stage a little bit with this glimpse into a literary movement within the horror genre. For a reason. I want to go back and tell you about a guy who was doing this in the pulp magazines in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, the author I'm talking about wrote extreme horror under the name of Russell Gray. That's Gray. He also occasionally wrote under the name Harrison Storm. Now, fans of paperback original crime fiction in the 1950s will know this guy under his real name, Bruno Fisher. Eric, you and I did an episode on Bruno Fisher back in the innocent days of March 2020. It was episode 35 of this very podcast, and I invite the listener to go check it out if you want to do a deep dive into Bruno Fisher's life and work, because he was a pretty interesting guy. In that episode, I touched briefly upon his extreme horror work in the pulps as Russell Gray, but now I feel better prepared to discuss this body of work at length. The reason is that I purchased, with my own hard-earned money, 2 collections, let me hand these to you, of selected stories by Russell Gray. The books are available from Ramble House. Grab those. And the stories were selected by this guy, John Palin, who wrote the introductions to both volumes. Volume 1 is Hostesses in Hell, and Volume 2 is My Touch Brings Death. Now, both volumes of these reprints that are in print right now are credited to the author as being written by Russell Gray, not by Bruno Fisher, even though that was his real name. In his introductory essays, Palin makes the case that this extreme horror was an outgrowth of readers' growing boredom with the weird menace genre of pulp stories that was where seemingly supernatural hauntings are revealed to have been the work of just human tricksters. I've read a bunch of those kind of stories. They're good, but after a while they sort of begin to feel like episodes of Scooby-Doo after you read a few. Anyway, so there was this editor who worked for Popular Publications who knew that he needed to get more extreme to hold an audience after 1936 or so. That guy's name was Rogers Terrell. And he had this idea that maybe the women facing a fate worse than death in the stories didn't need to be rescued by a hero at the end. He had this idea, and again, this is 1936, to turn up the level of sexual sadism of these stories and maybe have the bad guy or the monster really harm the girl in a violent and sexual manner before the hero rescues her. So as soon as Mr. Terrell put the word out to his stable of writers in this pulp magazine scene, some of these guys stepped up their game and they started delivering these crazy, sexually sadistic stories. There was a guy named Wyatt Blessingame and another one, Arthur J. Burks. They started writing these stories. Meanwhile, there's an author named Paul Ernst, and he wanted nothing to do with this stuff, and he refused to participate. Then Bruno Fisher gets into the mix with stories that he wrote under the name Russell Gray, and he blew everyone out of the water. And he began to get top billing on the covers of magazines like Terror Tales, Dime Mystery, and Sinister Stories. Now, we're talking about the years 1937 to 1941 here. In his introduction, John Palin makes the case that Bruno Fisher's secret when he wrote these stories as Russell Gray was his ability to imagine the worst things to happen to a person and then turn it up a notch from there. He also created really vivid characters that you actually believed in. These weren't just stereotypical teens on Lover's Lane getting slaughtered by Jason Voorhees. Fisher was a great writer. So you got to know the characters before bad things happened to them. And when those bad things happened, nearly always some form of extreme torture, he vividly describes the physical pain and anguish experienced by the character that you've gotten to know. So Fisher wrote a ton of these stories. Now, again, not all of them were masterpieces, but many were very good if you can handle the premise. The big 3 magazines in this area were Terror Tales, Horror Stories, and Dime Mystery. Terror Tales and Horror Stories both stopped publishing in 1941, and Dime Mystery eventually switched over to actual mystery stories that same year. This genre of extreme horror really just kind of went away, arguably until splatterpunk arose 30 years later. So I read a bunch of these Russell Gray stories collected in the Hostesses in Hell book that collects 9 of the stories from the pulps. Now, the book was actually published in 2011, but it's still in print. It's available from Amazon as a trade paperback for $20. But before I share my thoughts, Eric, do you have any questions or comments about the history of this brief literary movement?
So let me make sure I understand. Are the victims in these stories typically always going to be women? I mean, do you think that it's like an outpouring of the author to do like authoritarianism, like man dominates woman? Is that kind of thing?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't delved that deeply. Definitely the victims are women.
Okay.
What was going on? I mean, I have to figure that the readership at the time was primarily men.
Okay.
And that there was some sort of demand in the marketplace for dudes wanting to read about like women getting their breasts burned off and stuff.
It's like the author is venting his personal issues through literature of torturing or hurting women.
Maybe, but I've never heard anything that Bruno Fisher was a particularly brutal or awful guy. I think he was just a writer looking to make a living, and the market's demanding this. His editor tells him to write these books, but he seemed to be these stories, and he seemed to be very adept at it.
Yeah. Okay.
The important thing to know about these Russell Gray stories and these collections is that no one's going to want to read all these stories back to back. But I have to say, having read a few, they work fairly well if you kind of dip in and out of them, if you want an extremely violent palate cleanser between other books. If you're going to read only one Russell Gray story in your entire life, I would say the one to read is called Fresh Fiancés for the Devil's Daughter. It originally appeared in the 1940 issue of Marvel Tales magazine. John Palin describes it as the single most repellent piece of horror fiction ever published.
Wow.
So it's a good place to start, if any. And if you don't have $300 to buy that pulp, you can spend $20 on this Russell Gray collection of stories called Hostesses in Hell. Here's a key, though. If you don't want to spend that much and you have a Kindle, there's a collection of wild pulp stories available from Wildside Press for 99 cents. The collection's called the Pulp Fiction Megapack, and it's the one with an illustration of an ape holding onto a rope ladder. The 99 cents gets you 25 classic pulp stories on your Kindle, and with Fresh Fiancés for the Devil's Daughter by Russell Gray being one of them, kind of in the middle of the anthology. Now, Wildside screwed it up and they left off the word fresh in the title, but the text of the story is exactly the same. I compared the two. The story, Fresh Fiancés for the Devil's Daughter, begins in a crowded and drunken literary party in Manhattan in an apartment. Our narrator is a literary agent named Lester Marlin, and he can't keep his eyes off a woman who just entered the party. She introduces herself as Tala Mag, and Lester is somehow able to fend off her wanton advances by basically saying, hey baby, my wife's here at the party. Now, but Lester, he's a good dude, and he's really, really into his wife. The next morning, Lester received a note from the party's hostess, who's also his best client, asking him to meet with Tala Mag because she's an aspiring author in search of representation. A second note from Tala requests that Lester come to her Park Avenue penthouse later that day for a meeting. So he's got these misgivings, but then he agrees to meet with Tala to appease his client. At the meeting, Tala, she's in like full seduction mode, but she's also demanding that he read a story that she wrote. So he reads her manuscript, and he finds it to be dark, vile, evil, and absolutely unprintable. He explains to her that her story is too vile to be printed. Now, Tala is not the kind of lady who takes no for an answer. He tries to escape her apartment. He's subdued. He's rendered unconscious and later awakens naked and bound by chains inside Tala's room of torment. Now, Tala is also naked, and she whips Lester for several pages in a very S&M-like scene. Somehow Lester gets away, but he doesn't tell his wife about the incident because he's super embarrassed. Now, soon thereafter, Lester and his wife are invited to go to a remote lake house by a publisher that he knows. When he gets there, there's all these other literary types there, and the whole thing turns out to be a trap set by this lady, Tala Mag. And all the people who were invited are people who neglected to help her get her writing published.
That's okay.
So what Bruno Fisher is doing here is he's clearly having some fun pitting an author against a literary agent in a battle that's sparked by the rejection of the exact kind of story that Fisher himself was writing under the name Russell Gray. That makes sense.
That's really clever.
So at the lake house, Talamag starts torturing one of the wives by basically burning off her breasts while everyone else has to watch. It's really violent and really grotesque, and it's described in super painstaking detail. The torture story becomes a revenge story with kind of an expanded cast of victims, more sizzling breasts, and kind of a most dangerous game, hunt the human gimmick. That was actually pretty exciting reading. Beyond that, I don't want to give too much away from the story. It's called, again, Fresh Fiancés for the Devil's Daughter. It was extreme, definitely, but it wasn't really scary. I can't say it was a scary story. It's just a lot of torture. It was suspenseful and never boring, but I was never really into like torture porn like Saw or Hostel in the movies. It just was never my idea of a good time. You're a horror movie guy. Were you ever into those kind of horror movies?
I thought the first Saw movie was great, but then the rest of them all turned into torture every 20 minutes, and Hostel was just ridiculous.
Yeah. So anyway, I did like this 38-page novella. I can definitely recommend it because Fisher was just such a talented writer, and he could really craft propulsive and exciting action sequences. Even at this early stage of his career, he could develop a compelling story. The listener, by now listener, whether this is going to be your thing or not. And if it is, you're going to really like this story. He had a much scarier story that I thought really did a nice job. It was actually called Hostesses in Hell. It's the title story from this collection. It originally appeared in Terror Tales in the March-April 1939 issue. The narrator is this inexperienced recreational sailor named Jay, who takes 7 women out on his boat for a ride up and down the local ocean shoreline. A spontaneous storm washes them onto an island, and his boat becomes disabled. On the island, this group of these women and the one dude are greeted by a man claiming to be a medical doctor. But he looks more like the wild-eyed muscle man. He claims to run this hotel on the island where Jay and the ladies can stay until they can arrange for transport back to the mainland. Upon arrival at this large colonial house, the doctor then confesses that the building is actually a sanitarium for the incurably insane.
Wow.
So this being a short story, things go from very creepy to very violent and scary rather quickly. The women are naked, the lunatics have escaped. They're freakishly deformed creatures. They're menacing the island's guests. It was actually legitimately scary and extremely violent and disturbing. I thought it was just really an outstanding pulp horror story. Another cool story, which I want to tell you about, is called School Mistress of the Mad. This one first saw print in the January-February 1939 issue of Terror Tales. Doom is the name of this town, nestled in the mountains. It strikes me very much like where you grew up.
Okay. All right.
It's populated by an inferior race of idiots, just like your town, who are looked down upon by the good people of a nearby town called Ampton. Now, Doom was settled during the American Revolutionary War by a family named Gring, who have reproduced and lived there ever since with no contact from the outside world. So generation after generation of inbreeding has made the Gring clan into beast-like idiots.
Okay.
A beautiful woman named Linda is driving through this nice nearby town, headed into Doom. So she stops to ask directions, and she discloses that she's been hired to be the new school teacher for the town of Doom.
Okay.
Now, the idea of the Grings hiring a beautiful school teacher in an illiterate town without a school defies logic.
Makes no sense.
Right. Meanwhile, several young women from the nearby town of Ampton have become missing lately. Could the Grings, Eric, be doing something illegal to increase Doom's genetic diversity? A young man named Chet sets off to Doom to investigate and maybe save Linda from the hillbillies 15 miles away. The author does a great job of building the dread and suspense for the reader who's left wondering how bad it could really be in Doom. I'm happy to report that the Gring clan is absolutely worse than you could possibly imagine. I found the story to be actually very chilling and frightening if you enjoy satanic hillbilly stories in the vein of Deliverance or The Hills Have Eyes. It's hard to believe that a story 82 years old still packs this much of a visceral punch. So I guess in conclusion, I just want to say that if you're a fan of suspenseful horror and you're not afraid of some bloody, exploitive violence, this Russell Gray guy, these books written by Bruno Fisher under the name of Russell Gray, he really was the real deal. In fact, I would say that this book, Hostesses in Hell, may be the most consistently solid, single-author horror anthology I've read since Stephen King's Night Shift.
Come on.
No, I'm gonna push it. I'm going all in on this.
Wow.
Night Shift was just a great collection of horror stories. I think Hostesses in Hell is also a great collection of single author horror stories. When I read a short story collection by an author, there's usually a lot of really bad, crappy stories in it. Yeah. This one was all solid. I ordered Volume 2, My Touch Brings Death, and I handed that to you. I'm going to check that out at some point. I love Bruno Fischer's crime novels, but his extreme horror may actually, I believe, be the best stuff he ever wrote. Now, you need to know what you're getting, and you need to be comfortable with a bunch of really gross scenes, but I got to give this collection my highest recommendation. I should also say that there's an ebook publisher called Pulp Fiction Bookstore. You can find them by Googling. They've reprinted a lot of Bruno Fischer's work from the pulp era as ebooks. And they were generous enough to send me some review copies of Bruno Fischer titles, which include The Dead Don't Die, Restless Hands, The Spider Lily, The Letter Death Wrote, and other stories. The ebooks published by this outfit are about $4 a piece. It's way cheaper than spending $100 on a tattered copy of the Pulp magazine, so you should check them out. That website's is pulpfictionbook.store, or if you just Google Pulp Fiction Bookstore, you'll see it there. Any thoughts, or should we go to your review?
One of the stories in here, I was laughing at the title. One of the stories just simply says, "Say yes to Satan." That's the title.
Yeah, there's a lot of devil worship and devil imagery in these things. I mean, again, these are fun. I don't know if they're fun. They're good. They're good horror stories. That's the best I can tell you. If you're into this type of stuff, you're gonna like this guy, Russell Gray. And
I'm having a complete brain fart here, but these are coming out after the death of H.P. Lovecraft, correct? He wasn't in the...
You know way more about Lovecraft and his timeline than I do. I'm totally in the dark on Lovecraft. I mean, he's one of these guys I know I should be reading more of and know I should know more about, but I'm an idiot when it comes to all things Lovecraft.
I'm sure, if anything, they were inspired by... he was inspired by Lovecraft. But anyway.
Probably.
All right. So I'm going to tame it down. I'm going to go with just the normal action-adventure review here. So I'm going to do Blood Oath by David Morrell. As I mentioned earlier, this is an author we don't talk about much here on the show, and we need to change that. Morrell became a household name based on his first published novel, which was called First Blood, published in 1972. As you know, that book was adapted for cinema and became the first of, what are they up to, five? I think they're 5 Rambo films now, all starring Sylvester Stallone. Morrell even wrote the novelizations of some of those films. Now, what drew me to Blood Oath was the blurb on the back. We keep talking about Stephen King. This blurb is from Stephen King, and it's saying that he defies readers not to finish this book in one sitting. It's kind of a bold statement, but spoiler alert, it took me longer than that. I couldn't do it. The book stars a guy named Peter Houston, and he's a successful novelist, and he's a college professor. And when he was a kid, his father died in a French battlefield during World War II. It's one of those situations where his mom reminds him throughout his life that his father was this great American and great soldier and, just really great dad. So Peter's mom dies, and he goes to France with his wife Jan because his father's buried in a grave there at the battle site with all the other Americans that died during this fight. And Peter's never been there before. So he shows up, and he asks the cemetery folks there where his father's grave is. And they look it up in the books, and guess what? They tell him that there's no record whatsoever of his father being buried there. Nothing.
Huh.
Peter remembers his mom telling him that a French soldier named Pierre de Saint-Laurent promised that he would always look after the grave because of the immense gratitude he has for what the Allied forces did for France. That's great, but the problem is when he starts asking about this Pierre de Saint-Laurent guy, people start dying. Pete and Jan are attacked multiple times, and eventually this killer or killers succeeds, and Jan is murdered in a car accident. Now, weeks later, after Pete heals up, he starts tracking down the mysteries surrounding the St. Laurent guy and the secrecy surrounding his father's grave and even his father's military service. And like a good international thriller, Morrell mixes in tons of bombings. There's gunfights. There's car chases. There's this really cool sprint through a forest, trying to find the killers while avoiding his own death. Peter also teams up with a beautiful woman whose father may have ties to the overall mystery. I think Morrell sees the opportunity to write this high adventure styled yarn And I think it easily fits in line with the same kind of stuff that Hammond Ennis and Desmond Bagley were doing. And for me, and not really David Morrell, but for me, Blood Oath also has a late 90s, early 2000s Dean Koontz kind of thriller feel where, you know how Koontz books always had that shadowy government guy.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
He's always hunting the average citizen. He does that kind of thing. But there's World War II history thrown in. There's the mandatory Nazi gold thrown in. There's high altitude adventure in the snowy mountains, and a very stereotypical villain that's just really darn evil. Listeners, I like the fact that Morrell designed this character Pete to be an author, because Pete also writes adventure thrillers, so he can use a lot of his research experience to defy the bad guys. Stuff like firearm experience, wilderness survival, evasive driving. These are all utilized by Pete based on his own book research. This parallels David Morrell's own career, where he lists all those types of talents on his own biography page. If you're looking for a high-speed, high-adventure yarn, Blood Oath is pretty good. Morrell has better books, though. If you really need a cool, creepy vibe, read his novel Creepers. Have you ever read that?
No, a friend of mine in North Carolina told me to read it.
It's great.
It's great. I have a copy.
It's good. There's a sequel, too, called Scavenger. But that book blew me away. But Blood Oath didn't have that same effect, but still, I think, worth your time. Anyway, this is Blood Oath by David Morrell.
I'm going to hand you this book here because I'm totally in love with this cover art. The book is called The Hoodlums by John Eagle, and it was originally released in 1953. The novel was recently re-released by Black Gat Books, which is the mass-market paperback imprint of Starkhouse Books. John Eagle was a pseudonym of George Benet. That's B-E-N-E-T. So the Black Cat re-release is credited to George Benet writing as John Eagle. Now, to their credit, Black Cat retained the original cover art by illustrator Kirk Wilson, and it has two hoodlums standing outside a nightclub having a smoke, and you can see past them inside the club where there's a go-go dancing girl on the stage shaking her moneymaker. I confess that I've never actually heard of George Benet or his pen name John Eagle, but I was able to learn that Benet was born in my hometown of Chicago in 1918. He served in the Army during World War II and then moved to San Francisco, got married, and went into the fast-growing career as a used book dealer. In 1952, when paperbacks were exploding as a medium, Mr. Benet moved to New York City, specifically Greenwich Village, and he writes this crime novel called The Hoodlums. He successfully sold the book to Avon, which was not the most prestigious paperback house at the time, but it was far from the worst. And the book sold 500,000 copies at 25 cents a pop. So I think this paperback qualified as a hit. In fact, Avon actually reprinted the book again in 1956. For reasons totally unclear to me, he doesn't follow up with another book. The dude was a one-hit wonder. In 1959, Dell released an anthology of short stories called Great Tales of Action and Adventure by a George Bennett, B-E-N-N-E-T-T. But that guy had 2 T's in his Bennett. The Hoodlum guy had 1 T. I have no idea if it's the same guy or not. Neither George Bennett or George Benet left much of a mark on the paperback era. What I do know is that R. George Benet, the author of this hit paperback, The Hoodlums, moved back to San Francisco and he got a union job as a longshoreman. And while he was working, he earned his master's degree from Berkeley, and in the 1970s, he wrote 2 books under his own name. A book of short stories and poems in 1977 called A Place in Kalusia, and a novel in 1988 called A Short Dance in the Sun. Now, neither book made any kind of splash at all, and the guy died in 1990 at age 72. Bottom line is all we really have from this guy is the book The Hoodlums. And thanks to Black Cat Books, it's back in print, and it's worthy of a segment on the world's most popular vintage paperback podcast, 103 years after the author was born and 68 years after the book was published. Isn't it crazy the world works there?
Yeah, it really is. Hey, speaking of this Bennett guy, I could have swore you've read and reviewed one of his books. What didn't he do Murder Money or something? It's a blue cover.
That's got to be a different guy. I do remember that book. I don't think it definitely wasn't this guy. Guy.
It was a Bennett. Okay.
Bennett's not that uncommon of a name.
Okay. So what's this book about?
Okay, so I just finished it. Despite being lucky, smart, and aggressive, this ex-con Kirk Wagner he's absolutely dead broke at age 26. He had a 3-year stint in prison that arose from an armed robbery that was followed by a double cross that landed him in the slammer, while his partner at the robbery, Martin, got away with the money. Now, to his credit, Kirk never squealed. And now that he's been out for 2 weeks, Kirk is trying to make ends meet with a legit job in Chicago, but man, it's just not working out. So 3 years without a woman is a long time. And so Kirk tries to catch up with Jeannie, this hot little dish that he dated for a while before he got arrested. The time has been good to Jeannie. She is stacked and seems to be a very old sex-positive kind of chick. Meanwhile, Kirk gets word that his old pal Martin has returned to Chicago. He allegedly wants to make things right for the double cross that landed Kirk in prison, but how do you repay for someone who you landed in the slammer for 3 years? Benet, or Eagle, was a much better writer than most of his 1953 paperback contemporaries. His plotting, however, was a bit slow and meandering and kind of largely non-existent. The first quarter of the book has Kirk and his vagrant friends just kind of bumming around Chicago, trying to stay warm and behaving like the drunken characters from a David Goodis book. Then when Martin returns to Chicago, something resembling a normal scam plot begins to take place. It's all very well-written and compelling, but you never describe the hoodlums as being a propulsive thriller or even having a normal story arc. Things happen, but it's more like a reality show following a small-time hoodlum around Chicago's underworld as he barely makes ends meet. Some of the vignettes are better than others, and the novel was never boring, but it never really had much of a plot. But I still found myself enjoying it. It was kind of like a blues song set to like this melodic prose, and I appreciated how different it was. Most of the crime fiction novels from the early 1950s really made their magic from tightly wound stories with twists and turns along the way. But the Hoodlums took a different route, and it still largely worked for me. Your mileage as a reader may vary. The book, again, is called The Hoodlums by George Benet, writing as John Eagle. You can get the reprint from Amazon or the Starkhouse Books website. And I think that's about it for this week. So why don't you wrap us up, Eric?
Jay Bennett, by the way. Jay Bennett, Murder Money.
You got it.
This concludes today's episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. Please join us every day at paperbackwarrior.com for reviews of both amazing and terrible old books, and follow us on Facebook to join the conversation. Until next week, this is Eric on behalf of Tom, signing off.